Well, you know, we have the wonderful thing of the birth of Jesus, and we know about that. And often, you know, we've got all the things. One thing that impressed me many years ago, what we had was the wise men. They came in, and remember, June, your sister, June Jill, your younger sister, who got all the robes ready for everybody, and everybody, the wise men stole the show. It was really lovely to see it. But there are so many of us, and I'm one of them, who wondered what it was all about. I didn't know much about it, and I thought I would study it because it's known as the Epiphany. And so I've gone and collected material about the Epiphany, or the wise men, is because I wanted to know more of it. For I know that sometimes we don't know exactly whereabout they came in. But I collected the material, so I'm going to give it to you as I found it, the material I had. So it's called The Wise Men. Surely one of the great stories of Christmas is the story of the visit of the wise men from the East. Wherever the story of the birth of Jesus is told, so too is told the delightful tale of strange men from some faraway land who brought gifts to the baby Jesus. From time as far as I can remember back, children's Christmas pageant has included them. We see Joseph, Mary, and Jesus in the middle, shepherds on the left, wise men on the right, and two other gifts which are sometimes difficult to pronounce. Well, the story comes to us only in Matthew's Gospel. None of the other Gospels, Mark, Luke, or John, they never tell anything about the wise men. Only Matthew tells it. And we can, so who are the wise men? And where did they come from? How many were there? What is the star they saw, and how did it lead them to Bethlehem? How long after the birth of Jesus did they arrive in Jerusalem? And how did they know that the baby was going to be the King of the Jews? Because of this mystery and many unanswered questions, great legends grew up about them. Over the centuries, the wise men were given names. Now, I remember one day we were asked as a quiz just about Christmas time in the old church here, how many wise men were there? And I says, we don't know. Now, Joan Gillis was just a very little girl at the time, and she was sitting in the seat beside her mother, just behind me. She says, Mummy, we do know there were 3, and I'll tell you their names. And she remembered their names, and she wasn't at school. Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar. They were venerated as saints, and a tradition arose called the Adoration of the Magi. In fact, you can go to the cathedral in Cologne in Germany, and you will find relics alleged to be the remains of the wise men. Now, in 1990, my friend and I went to ceremonies in Germany, And we were at the cathedral in Cologne, and we saw these, or otherwise I would never have seen them and never thought of it at the time. But their relics are alleged to be the remains of the wise men. But you could puzzle over these questions, and you could play it over in your mind a few dozen times, but you have as many mysteries at the end as you did at the beginning, and that is part of the perennial fascination of this Christmas story. Now, it all began this way, and we will look at the Matthew, who brings the story in Matthew chapter 2, and it begins in verse 1, I think it's verse 1, and it ends at verse 12. And it's the visit of the wise men it reached, Matthew 2. Now, when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, and saying, where is he that is born of the Jews? Or who is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him. When Herod the king had heard these things, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And when he had gathered all the chief priests and scribes of the people together, he demanded of them where Christ should be born. And these wise men of the country said unto him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for there is written, it is written by the prophets, and thou, Bethlehem, in the land of Judea, art not the least among the princes of Judah, for out of thee shall become a governor that shall rule my people Israel. Then Herod, when he had privily called the wise men, inquired of them diligently what time the star appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, go and search diligently for that young child, and when you have found him, bring me word again, that I may come and worship him also. When they had heard the king, they departed, and lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy. And when they were come into the house, they saw the young child with Mary his mother, and fell down and worshipped him. And then when they had opened their treasures, they presented unto him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. So, this was amazing, isn't it, to think about it. Right away, they discover something interesting. The wise men, whoever they are, show up in Jerusalem after the birth of Jesus. That runs contrary to the notion that the shepherds and the wise men arrived in Bethlehem at the same time. Not so. The shepherds were there the night Jesus was born. Remember the angels singing, "Glory to God in the highest, on earth peace, goodwill toward men." The wise men came sometime later, but how much later? No one really knows. It may have been a few months later. Some think even a year or so later. But one hint in what I have found is it was at least a few days later, because when the wise men find Jesus, he is with his mother in a house in Bethlehem, not in a manger in a stable. That, by the way, fits well into the tradition of the Eastern Orthodox Church, that the wise men came 12 days after Christmas, on January 6th. And that's why the Sunday closest to January the 6th is called Epiphany. To the church, in the church year. And Epiphany celebrates the manifestation of Christ to the Gentiles. These wise men, of course, were Gentiles. As a further note, that's where the 12 days of Christmas came from. Remember the 12 days of Christmas, and we learned all these things. Traditionally, the 12 days of gift giving lead you from his birth on December 26th to the arrival of the wise men on January 6th. As I said, though, this, pardon me, this is only a tradition, but it is a very old tradition, and it could quite well be correct. The answer is, they have come to see the baby born to be King of the Jews. Now this is fascinating. They knew a baby had been born, but they didn't know where. They knew he was a king, but didn't know his name. So they came to Jerusalem, the capital city, seeking help. They also assume that everyone must know about this baby, but a great surprise awaits him. Yes, it's wondering. Verse 2 adds a detail that has baffled and intrigued Bible scholars and astronomers for 2,000 years. These men say, "We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him." Now, if we think about it, people generally travelled in groups, and they travelled by day, which makes sense. But these men were doing what nobody else had ever done. They were travelling by night, because it's the only time stars shine is during the night. So they were travelling during the night. So what was this star in the east? What did they see, and how did they know that it was the star? And how did they connect it with Israel? It helps to remember that the wise men were students of the sky. That means they would not be frightened or put off by anything unusual that suddenly appeared to them. It also helps to know that in those days it was not uncommon to associate the birth of a great ruler with unusual heavenly phenomena. The star, whatever it was, would make perfect sense to them and would, in fact, perfectly fit in with what they already believed. They might say that if God wanted to get a message to these pagan priests, he picked the perfect way to do so. So, because the wise men were students of the sky, that is, they would not be frightened or put off by anything or anyone unusual that suddenly appeared to them. It also helps to know that in those days it was not uncommon to associate the birth of a great ruler with unnatural heavenly phenomena. You might say that if God wanted to get a message, these pagan priests, he picked the perfect way. I always marvel at the way God picks people to do things, people that we wouldn't think of, but he knows it all. But still, what was the star? The particular Greek word aster is a very general one. It refers to any bright object in the sky. It could refer to a star or a planet or a meteor or even a comet. Over the years, there have been four main theories. Well, Halley's Comet, unfortunately, the nearest appeared was in 11 BC, which is too early for the birth of Christ. 2, supernova. This was an exploding star that suddenly filled the sky with light in a brilliant, blinding flash of light. But these are unpredictable things. And the conjunction of the planets, this is probably the most popular theory. One version suggests that in 7 BC, Jupiter, Mars, and Saturn came together in a very rare conjunction by the Star of Wonders, presented the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. The people of Israel didn't believe this conjunction doesn't attract attention of people who don't normally watch the skies. They aren't highly visible phenomena like comets or supernova or meteor showers. But to anyone who watched the stars regularly, a triangular conjunction like the one in 7 BC would certainly attract attention. Well, and then they thought it could be a supernatural light, and that is held by most Christian people, a light placed by God in the atmosphere, especially for the Magi to see, and that is what it was. So now, like as we look at some of the things, we know that the Jews were looking for a Messiah. We know that the Magi looked to the star for guidance. We know that the Jews and the Magi had intermingled for at least 500 years. We know that the Magi would notice any new sign in the sky. Therefore, it should not surprise us that the Magi would travel to Jerusalem to greet this new Jewish king. The story in Matthew chapter 2 perfectly fits with everything we know. The reaction of Herod is fascinating. In verse 3 of Matthew 2, he said that when Herod heard the news, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. Now, he was disturbed, which really means he shook violently, and Herod was all shook up. Because he is a very old and a very sick man. He is a dying man tottering on an unstable throne. The idea of a baby born king of the Jews was a direct threat to him. He's scared too, because the Magi are potential threats to him. We don't know whether there were only 3 men or not, but even if there were, they certainly did not travel alone. These men were too important. Most of our pictures of the Magi show 3 men dressed like kings, riding 3 camels across the desert. Nothing could be farther from reality. There is no way under heaven the Magi travelled 1,000 miles across the desert by themselves. The whole notion is ludicrous. In those days, the only way you could travel in the desert was by a large caravan, a camel caravan. That's what it said, a whole group of people. Now, it's interesting that the Magi had no trouble gaining an audience with Herod. That fact attests to their importance. So Herod turns to the scribes and priests for advice. He has only one question. Where is this child to be born? Verse 4. The scribes have even not to look it up. They already know the answer. 700 years earlier, the prophet Micah had predicted the Messiah's birth in Bethlehem. That was common knowledge. In Israel, little children learned that in Sabbath school before they were 6 years old. So it's hard to believe that Herod did not know. Verses 5 and 6. If you add what the scribes knew to what the wise men figured out, you already conclude that the signs of Jesus' coming were clear enough for anyone to see. It is sometimes said that God always speaks loud enough for a willing ear to hear. He certainly did that here. The wise men knew and did something the scribes knew and did nothing. Herod now does something we think strange. He calls the wise men and asks them when the star first appeared to him. In verse 8, verse 7, the verse says, it indicates he wanted an exact time. He didn't tell them why he wanted to know, and we find out why later than this. In verse 8, when Herod realized he had been outwitted by the Magi, for they did not tell him. Now, how did they know? How did they know that his intentions were not to worship to the king? Jesus must have told the wise men. So he was very furious, and what he did was gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he learned from the Magi. It appears that the Magi told Herod that the star first appeared to them 2 years earlier. Does that suggest that Jesus had been born 2 years earlier, or did the star appear 2 years earlier to give them plenty of time to make the journey? Perhaps it took them 2 years to make the journey from Persia. We can't be sure. It seems likely that Herod assumed that the star first appeared when the child was born. If the Magi told him it had first appeared 2 years ago, then that explains why Herod ordered all of the male children in Bethlehem under 2 years to be put to death, which is dreadful. Now, how we can't be sure about this, but neither could Herod. What we have at this point is a very interesting situation. The Magi haven't seen the baby, Jesus, yet, so they don't know how old he is. The scribes know where he is to be born, but they evidently don't believe the Magi knew what they are talking about. Meanwhile, Herod knows where the baby is to be born, but not how old he is. So he makes sure he kills them. He gives orders to kill and slaughter of all the baby boys in Bethlehem. In his mind, he wanted to kill them all to make sure he gets the one he wants. Herod is up to no good, and for all their wisdom, the Magi fall for his trick. But why shouldn't they? If they have come so far to worship the child, why wouldn't Herod do as much? They have no reason to suspect his motives. At this point, something unusual happens. Verse 9. As the Magi set out for Bethlehem, which was only 6 miles south of Jerusalem, the star they saw in the east suddenly reappears. I think they first saw it in the east set out on their own for Jerusalem and didn't see it again until they left for Bethlehem, which makes me think it was a heavenly light by God given to them. Verse 9 is very specific. It says, "The star went on before them until it came and stood over the very home where the baby Jesus was." That's necessary because although they know the child is in Bethlehem, they don't know where in Bethlehem. So the star leads them to the right house. Verse 10. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful, being led to the house? That does not sound like any natural star. It sounds like a miraculous star created by God to lead the Magi to a particular house. No wonder they rejoice with exceeding great joy. The end of their long, hard journey was at hand. Verse 11 tells us that coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. You may ask the question, when the Magi finally found the baby Jesus, were they disappointed? They might have been. After all, they had been through such a long journey. After the detour in Jerusalem, they did what they find soon and anticlimatized it. It might have seemed that way, because when they came into that house, they looked at the child. He did not look like a king. His home did not look like a castle. He had no scepter in his hand, commanded no armies, gave no speeches, passed no laws. He could not walk or talk. He was still a baby. No royal decree came from his lips. There was nothing to make one think he was a king. To the outward eye, he was nothing but a peasant child born in poverty. But to the Magi, he was a king. He possessed more royalty in a cradle than Herod possessed in his fine palace. He was greater in his infancy than Louis XIV in his ascendancy. He was more powerful as a child than Napoleon as an emperor. But it did not seem that way. The eyes of flesh revealed, as one looked, revealed nothing but a normal baby, gurgling and cooing and moving his tiny hands and just lifting them down at his side, reaching eagerly for his mother's goodness. Somehow the Magi saw beyond the present and into the future, and in deep faith they worshipped him. They saw that this child would one day rule the world, and they were not ashamed to fall on their faces before him. I'll now paraphrase the words of one Bible commentator here. Although we read that the Magi met Herod, we do not read that they worshipped him. But when they found this tiny baby, not yet 2 weeks old, rocking in his mother's arms, these great men fell on their faces before him. To this baby they gave the honor due a king. What Herod craved, the baby received. Now we come to the last detail of the one which the Magi most remembered. Last part of verse 11. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. The gifts in themselves are expensive and represent a worthy tribute. But beyond that, there is a very ancient tradition that sees these gifts as symbolic of who this child would become. The early church fathers said that gold represented the wealth and power of a king. Frankincense was used in the temple worship of the Lord. It represents the deity. He is truly God, born in human flesh. Then there is myrrh, a kind of perfume made from the leaves of the ciscus rose. It was used in beauty treatments, but when mixed with vinegar, it became an anesthetic. After a person died, myrrh was used to anoint the body and prepare it for burial. John chapter 10, verse 30, John chapter 90, verse 39, tells us that Jesus' body was bound in linen wrappings along with 75 pounds of myrrh and aloes. So the gift of myrrh pictures his suffering and death. Gold pointing to his majesty, for he is a king. Frankincense pointing to his deity, for he is God. Myrrh pointing to his humanity, for he is destined to suffer and die. We ask, did the Magi understand all this? No, not at all. But God arranged it so that their gifts to the Holy Child would point us to who he is and why he came. The hymn writer understood it perfectly. Listen to these words. Born a king on Bethlehem's plain, gold I bring to crown him again. King forever, ceasing never, over us all to reign. Frankincense to offer have I, incense, owns a deity high, prayer and praising, all men raising, worship him, God on high. Myrrh is mine, the bitter perfume, breathless, a life of gathering gloom, sorrowing, sighing, bleeding, dying, sealed in the stone-cold tomb. Then the last verse. Glorious now, behold him arise, King and God and sacrifice. Alleluia, alleluia, sound through the earth and skies. 3 abiding truths. 1, offer these abiding truths from this story for your consideration. 1, if the wise men can find Jesus, then all of us can. Think of how many barriers they had to cross to get to Jesus. There was a culture barrier, a distance barrier, a language barrier, a racial barrier, a religious barrier, not to speak of a hostile king, and indifference, different religious leaders. It wasn't easy for them to find Jesus, but they did. If they found him, then so can we. A good time of the year to find him too, in a deeper sense. Two, if God can use a star to reach these pagan astrologers, then he can use anything to reach anybody. Sometimes we despair of seeing our friends come to Christ because nothing we say seems to have the slightest effect on them. This story ought to give us great hope. Our God is infinitely creative. The things he can use to break through to people who seem to be so far from him. He can use a star, a book, a tract, a television show, a song, a bow and arrow, and a chance comment, or anything he desires. If God can reach the wise men, he can reach anybody. 3, if the wise men offered Jesus gifts fit for a king, then should we. It's good to remember that the tradition of giving gifts at Christmas time did not start with Santa Claus. It started with the wise men. Often we get so caught up in giving and receiving that we forget where it all began. It is good to give gifts to each other. It is even better to give gifts to Jesus. It is good to show our love to those we love. It is even better to show our love to the one who loved us when we were unlovely. This surely is the central meaning of the story. This year and every year, and all during the year, we are invited to return to Bethlehem. A baby lies there who is king and God and sacrifice. The king in the cradle, the deity in nappies, the sacrifice resting in his mother's arms. Before long, he will arise to do his work, and the world will see him as he really is. For the moment the baby sleeps in Bethlehem, surrounded by legal gifts and foreign eyes wide with wonder. Amen.